Hello, friends. Welcome to Calligraphy Tips with Lindsey. Last week, I needed to make more of a custom color of gouache I mixed up for a client. As you can see, I have less than half a jar here of this pretty blue, but I want almost a full jar to ensure I don't run out halfway through my project. I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to show you how I go about color matching when working with gouache. Here is everything I'll be using today. It's a good idea to keep notes on what paints you use whenever you make a new color. I usually write the pigments on a piece of tape to stick to the jar. I know that I originally made this blue using titanium white, Schmink Paris blue, a cool blue made of Prussian and phthalo blue, jet black, and a bit of ultramarine, a warm blue. This letter A is scrap from the initial project, and it's written on the same paper I'm going to be using again. This is the little mixing brush I'm using. I have several of these that generally only get used for mixing ink or loading ink onto nibs when I'm doing delicate or careful work. To start, I thoroughly mix up the old gouache. I'm going to be adding new gouache into this jar to increase the overall amount I have instead of making a new batch from scratch. Doing it this way can make color matching a little easier since there's a decent amount left of the first mix, and it minimizes waste. Once it's mixed, I add a fresh little swatch of the color onto my test sheet next to the letter A so that I have a fresh reference for the color in addition to the older sample. This is also a good way to double check that the gouache in the jar is in fact the same color that I used before and that I want to match this time. I also still have a little of this blue in a dinky dip that I haven't cleaned out since I last used it. So I'm also mixing that up and adding a fresh swatch of the gouache from the dinky dip to my test sheet just to make sure everything matches before I start mixing. When mixing directly into an existing batch of gouache, it's a good idea to set aside a small reserve in a dinky dip like this so that you have a separate sample of your original color in case you want to reference it while you're mixing. I always start with white when that's going to be part of my mix. It's easy to overestimate how much I'll need of the darker colors, and then discover I need a lot of white to get the right value. This often results in making much more than I need. Gouache dries darker than it looks when wet, so starting lighter also makes it easier to slowly work my way to the right hue and value by adding small amounts of the other colors. I'm using the staff of an old plastic pen holder to knock the white off the tube and into my jar. This helps prevent the tube of white from getting contaminated with any other colors and keeps it clean for whatever I'll need it for next. I like to use clear plastic or glass jars like these so that I can see the inside while I'm mixing. I know the new color is completely mixed in when I no longer get smears of it showing up on the inside surface of the jar. You can find little jars like this at science surplus stores, craft stores, beauty supply stores, or online. Here, The white has been completely mixed in, and I have a new, lighter blue color. Next up, I'm adding Paris blue. I'm not really worried about contaminating this color, so I just squeeze it directly into the jar. If you ever accidentally squeeze out more gouache than you want, you can often retract the excess back into the tube by gently squeezing the narrow sides. This trick works for all different kinds of paints. Once I've knocked the blue down into the jar, I add my black. I'm not measuring anything precisely here, just estimating proportions. I'll fine-tune the colors once I've increased the overall volume. I know from my notes that I didn't use much ultramarine, so I'm waiting to add any until I'm at that fine-tuning stage. I add a bit of water to keep my consistency fluid enough for easy mixing. Gouache works best for pointed pen when it's about the consistency of whole milk. If it's too thick, it won't flow off the nib. If it's too thin, it can lose some opacity. It's always easier to add more water than it is to make more gouache, unless it's a single color straight from the tube. So I like to mix my gouache a little thick and then add water in small amounts from a dropper like this until I have the consistency I want. Now that I've added my colors and some fresh water, I have about the volume of gouache I want. So I mix everything up really well again, making sure there aren't any little bits of unmixed Paris blue or black floating around in the jar. And I do my first swatch test of the new color. It looks pretty close, so I also try it out with a nib. The color difference doesn't show very well through the quality of my phone camera, but the new color is a little too cool. This is not surprising because the black and Paris blue mixed together make a cool green-black hue, and I have yet to add any of the warm ultramarine blue to balance that. I add a small amount of the ultramarine, thoroughly mix it in, and test again. When fine-tuning a color like this, it's important to make sure your test swatches and marks are dry before comparing colors, because the gouache will look different when it's wet versus dry. This second test is really close, but again, it looks slightly too cool. So I add a little more ultramarine blue, mix again, and test again. And this time, I've got it just how I want it. Color matching like this can take practice. When you first try it, it can be easy to add way too much or way too little of a color. The more familiar you get with your mixing colors, the easier it gets to estimate how much you'll need in any given situation. It's also helpful to know a little about color theory and working with warm and cool mixing colors. This is a topic much too large for this video, though. If you'd find a video on the basics of color mixing helpful, let me know. If there's interest, I can make a future video all about using primary colors and warm and cool tones to get specific colors from a fairly limited palette. Have you tried matching old gouache mixes before? Any questions I didn't cover here? Or do you have any additional helpful tips you can share? Post them in the comments for everyone. I hope you found this helpful and will join me again for future calligraphy tips with Lindsey. As always, thank you for watching.